Hello and welcome to the June 1st podcast. I'm Ethan Moriarty, and today we're going to be diving into the story of one of the most powerful tornadoes in United States history. This is the in-depth story of the 2008 Parkersburg, Iowa EF5 Tornado. Parkersburg, Iowa was a small city about 20 miles west-northwest of Waterloo. If you're not familiar with Iowa state geography, Waterloo is kind of in the northeastern quadrant of the state. Like many small towns in the Great Plains and the Midwest, they really got off the ground thanks to railway depots. After the Civil War, the Illinois Central and Chicago Northwestern railroads had built lines through the town, and it really kind of established this growth in this small community. Parkersburg was officially incorporated in December of 1874, and at the turn of the century, the town had its own electrical plant built, and that was thanks to the residents. This kind of is an early look into the culture that Parkersburg had, as this community had a strong bond. Steady growth in the town occurred up until about the 1980s, where it plateaued around 1,800 residents, and at the time of the tornado, this was the similar stat in terms of numbers of residents in the community. About 8 miles east of Parkersburg is the small community of New Hartford, which is about 500 residents in 2008. It's another one of these small farming towns that was built along the rail lines in the early days of the Western expansion, and it is just another community that is along this rail line and is closely tied to Parkersburg, especially after this tornado event. Before getting into the specifics of the weather background of this event, let's get an understanding of the layout of Parkersburg. While we have discussed the rail line earlier, which is on the northern side of town, there is also a state highway that is kind of the main road that moves through this town, and that is Iowa State Highway 14, which isn't just a north, south, east, west deal in Parkersburg's context, but it is a highway that runs east-west on the south side of town and then north-south on the western side of town. So it kind of makes this L shape. Along the southern edge, so the east-west portion of this highway, are a lot of businesses. Not quite the downtown region, but there is a car dealership, a couple of banks, and churches. So a lot of community that's kind of centered around this area. The north end of town is where we see kind of the downtown area, where we have a lot more of the walkable main streets that you think of when it comes to small town America, where you have like your barber shops and mom and pop style businesses, for example. So that's in the northern area of town, whereas you have this more commercialized area to the south. Just north of the east-west running portion of Iowa 14 is the high school and a bunch of other residential style homes, typical suburban kind of setup, that grid setup that we're so used to seeing in the Midwest and Great Plains of the United States. The high school is a shared high school of Parkersburg residents and Aplington residents. Aplington, Iowa is just to the immediate west of Parkersburg, about 5 miles away. While most of Parkersburg is kind of centered around this central square of streets, like I said, kind of this common style that we see with Midwestern towns, there are some new developments off to the southeastern corner of the town with some newer built homes, kind of these branch out suburbs that allow people from the Waterloo area to kind of get a little bit more space and a little bit more breathing room, as Waterloo is a much larger community. Keep in mind, this new subdivision is less than a year old in the time of May 2008. Now, with this understanding of Parkersburg and kind of the surrounding geography, let's take a quick look at the weather context that preceded this tornado. This tornado event was a part of a multi-day tornado outbreak, all stemming from the same weather system. On May 22nd, Lee cyclone genesis took place off of the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. Now, you may be asking, what is Lee cyclone genesis? And this is basically an atmospheric process where a giant cyclonic circulation forms off of the downside of a mountain range, usually driven by some sort of upper-level trough in the jet stream. The Rocky Mountains are famous for this process, and it's a common mechanism for generating storm systems across the Great Plains. May 22, 2008 saw the start of this outbreak in the High Plains, with tornadoes occurring in Colorado, Wyoming, and western Kansas. Most notably in this first day of the outbreak was the Windsor, Colorado EF5. This was a highly unusual mile-wide wedge tornado extremely close to the Front Range of the Rockies. What made this tornado even weirder was the fact that it moved northwest. This is extremely unusual tornado behavior, and it mainly has to do with the fact that it kind of occurred on the northern side of this new cyclone surface low that was beginning to form off of the Front Range. Tornadoes of this intensity aren't typical in Colorado. While Colorado, particularly the eastern plains kind of near western Kansas, is known for tornadoes, they aren't usually these very strong wedge-type tornadoes. They're usually very high-based, highly visible, and a favorite of storm chasers because they usually provide great views. But for a low ground-scraping wedge tornado in basically just off of the mountains, this is extremely unusual. Unfortunately, the Windsor, Colorado tornado caused significant damage and ultimately also claimed a life of an individual. Also on May 22nd was an EF2 tornado near Laramie, Wyoming. This tornado threw semis from Interstate 80 and damaged local businesses. In total, 45 tornadoes were reported on the 22nd of May. More tornadoes occurred on the 23rd as the system began to translate eastward. Greensburg, Kansas, which was flattened by an EF5 tornado the year prior, narrowly avoided being hit by another large tornado, with EF3s occurring both southwest and northeast of the town. The second strongest tornado of this outbreak would occur this day as an EF4 struck west of Quinter, Kansas, injuring 2 individuals. The 23rd of May was the most active day of this outbreak, with 80 confirmed tornadoes. On May 24th, the risk area was focused more along the I-35 corridor, mainly between Kansas City down through Oklahoma City. Most of these tornadoes occurred in northern Oklahoma this day, though there were some weaker tornadoes confirmed in both North and South Dakota. This finally brings us to May 25th, the day of the Parkersburg event. The Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma outlined 2 moderate risk areas in both the upper Midwest and central Great Plains. Keep in mind that the moderate category is the second highest risk category that the Storm Prediction Center uses. The risk areas covered this day included western Wisconsin, southeastern Minnesota, northeastern Iowa, and then in the secondary area, the southeastern Nebraska area and most of Kansas. That big surface low that was originated off of the Rockies days prior was now located over Minnesota. Associated with this big surface low was a north-south oriented warm front that was draped over Iowa, along with a dry line and cold front further to the west, more into Nebraska. In between these two boundaries creates a very potent warm sector in northeastern Iowa. Convective available potential energy, otherwise known as the acronym CAPE, exceeded 3,000 joules per kilogram in the warm sector, meaning that the energy of rising air was very potent in this warm sector. At the time before storms initiated, there's basically a lid in place that keeps this air from rising. So all of this energy is stored in this warm air, and then eventually, once you get storms to initialize, it's going to explode upward and give you that juice needed to fuel the upward motion of the updrafts in storms. The other alarming factor that forecasters were aware of that prompted this moderate risk was the storm relative helicity, which is basically the measure of spin in the atmosphere relative to the storm's mean motion. There were observed values of over 200 meters squared per second squared in the lowest 1 kilometer of the atmosphere, meaning that there was very strong low-level shear to support tornadoes. In the late afternoon of May 25th, in the warm sector west of Parkersburg, a storm initiates and quickly matures into a supercell thunderstorm with a strong rotational updraft. At 4:22 p.m. Central Daylight Time, the National Weather Service office in Des Moines issues a tornado warning for that storm, as the local radar indicates strong rotation within this thunderstorm that is conducive of what could produce a tornado. This tornado warning includes Parkersburg, yet there is not yet a tornado on the ground, and the storm is still a ways from the city itself. Sometimes with these events, there are weaker tornadoes that precede the main show, but that was not the case with the Parkersburg event. The tornado would touch down 26 minutes after the first tornado warning at 4:48 p.m. local time. It starts 2 miles south of the town of Applington in farm fields. Most notable at this time, this tornado was carving cycloidal marks into cornfields, which were observed from the air the next day. These cycloidal marks are something that is observed with strong to violent tornadoes. Originally, this tornado was maintaining an east-northeast trajectory. The tornado was rapidly growing into a wedge, or basically a tornado that was wider than it was tall. A few farmsteads were impacted by this tornado as it matured, some of which achieving EF5 ratings. The tornado was 3/4 of a mile wide when entering the western side of Parkersburg, and it took a turn due east right over Iowa State Highway 14. As mentioned earlier, Iowa 14 is the main drag of businesses on the southern side of the small city. The tornado would directly follow Iowa Highway 14 on the south side of town, so basically along that bottom part of the L that we talked about earlier when discussing the geography of the town. The most intense damage would occur on this southern side of Parkersburg, where multiple properties would sustain EF5 level damage, or damage that is conducive of wind speeds over 200 miles per hour. Just to the north of Iowa 14 was the Applington Parkersburg High School, which would suffer EF4 level damage and basically destroyed the school with exterior walls collapsing, and much of the open areas like the gymnasium were completely leveled. Fortunately, school was not in session at the time of this tornado, as it was the Memorial Day weekend holiday. The businesses that we talked about earlier that lined this bottom portion of Parkersburg were completely leveled and also contributed to the eventual EF5 rating of this tornado. Many of these buildings were completely swept clean. Industrial buildings had their metal supports completely bent and yielded. And then, of course, there were also the home subdivisions that existed just to the north of the state highway and to the east of town that ultimately were completely swept clean. Keep in mind that this new subdivision of houses was less than a year old at the time of this tornado. These were well-built houses with sufficient anchoring and sturdy foundations. Some of these foundations were even damaged in the tornado itself. It's not often that we see tornadoes damage the foundations of these well-built homes. These are reinforced foundations, but yet in Parkersburg, not even these underground regions were safe for residents. After exiting Parkersburg, the storm would track over farm fields for several miles, impacting a few farmsteads along the way. At 5:09 p.m. local time, the tornado churned just north of the center of New Hartford. Though the main body of town missed a direct hit, a neighborhood along Deer Trail Drive would take the brunt of the storm. Similar to Parkersburg, homes were completely obliterated, leaving nothing above ground. It's noted that a few of these homes would earn EF5 level ratings. After New Hartford, the tornado would churn for nearly 30 more miles. Fortunately, it managed to avoid populated town centers, though there were farmsteads here and there that were impacted, though not to the same intensity that was seen in Parkersburg or New Hartford. A turn to the northeast signaled the end of the tornado as it occluded into the parent storm. This northeastern turn saved the town of Dunkerton. Had it not deviated, it would have hit dead on. The tornado dissipated less than 2 miles west-southwest of Fairbanks, Iowa, ending its over 40-mile-long reign of terror. Immediately following the tornado, emergency crews in Parkersburg began to mobilize. Keep in mind that Parkersburg is a very small city. I mean, I don't even know if 2,000 people could be considered a city. I mean, I guess it comes down to government structure, but that's beside the point. The immediate emergency crews are not exactly in the numbers needed to support a disaster of this scale. However, they had prepared for a situation like this. An incident command center was established that evening at the fire station, which was grazed by the outer edge of the tornado, but yet still standing. As emergency services came to the city in order to help, they were able to, from this incident command center, quickly dispatch people to areas and systematically and in a very methodical approach begin to section off the affected areas and render help to the people that needed it. The governor issued a disaster proclamation for Butler County, specifically in Parkersburg and New Hartford, and the Parkersburg Police Chief Chris Luring estimated that there could be up to 100 fatalities in Parkersburg given the scope of devastation, prompting the establishment of a temporary morgue. Even though the damage was beyond comprehensible in the south end of downtown, there was some good news, as the tornado had avoided Parkersburg Water Tower and treatment plant, meaning that there was still fresh water for the rest of the community. It's important to remember that sometimes these impacts can be much wider beyond the damage path itself. As crews worked through the night and into the next morning, it was clear that maybe the impacts weren't as bad as they thought when it came to the human side of the equation. In the end, there were 9 fatalities from this tornado, 7 of which in Parkersburg and 2 in New Hartford. Alarmingly, some of these fatalities occurred in the basement of a residence, which goes to show just how strong this tornado was. You could be doing all of the right things in order to shelter yourself from a tornado, but when the magnitude of a tornado is so strong, not even a basement can save you, and a storm shelter might be your only means of actually being able to survive a tornado. The National Guard was deployed as well as the Red Cross. Additionally, the President of the United States, George W. Bush at the time, also declared the area a disaster, which allowed for federal monetary aid and other resources to be allocated to Butler County. The president would also fly out to Parkersburg and see the damage himself in the days after the tornado. There were 70 reported injuries with this event. Oftentimes, this injury statistic gets overlooked by the fatalities, but this is something that shouldn't be the case, as oftentimes these injuries are life-changing. From spinal cord injuries to head trauma and even things like amputations, these are going to affect you for the rest of your life, and it will be forever a permanent reminder of the tornado. These can have lasting impacts on individuals, and this statistic is not something that should be overlooked ever. Fortunately, once again for Parkersburg, the downtown region was missed by the tornado, so those heart and soul local businesses were still in place, allowing for residents to rally around them for rebuilding the town. This type of thing is huge in disaster recovery because that stimulates the local economy and encourages individuals to stay in the community. As mentioned earlier, there is a strong sense of community in Parkersburg, and what we would see when it comes to the recovery of Parkersburg is something quite extraordinary, which we don't often see after a tornado impacts a small town. The immediate survey from the National Weather Service Weather Forecast Office in Des Moines confirmed it was definitely above an EF3. The determination of EF4 versus EF5 would require a more detailed analysis from outside experts, though. Once these people came in, it did not take long. In a press conference on the evening of the 26th, the National Weather Service confirmed the ranking of the tornado as an EF5. Detailed reports about the damage would follow in the coming months, but it was evident early on in the survey that there was sufficient evidence to rank this tornado as an EF5. This was only the second ever EF5 rating, as the first one was the Greensburg, Kansas tornado that occurred the year prior. The EF scale was implemented in 2007 and was a more up-to-date version of the original Fujita scale. So this EF5 rating was big news in the weather community. The final rating for this tornado was cemented as an EF5 with estimated peak winds of 205 miles per hour. The path was a 43-mile continuous track, and it was nearly a mile wide at its widest point. In the wake of a town-altering violent tornado, it is not often that we see a strong recovery. It is tough for these communities to bounce back, especially some of these smaller ones, and in Parkersburg case, they kind of defeated the odds. While they did have some things going for them, like infrastructure, like water in place, they fortunately had a very strong sense of community that allowed them to really rally around each other and have a neighbor-helping-neighbor mentality. The residents of Parkersburg were resilient, not moving away after the tornado had flattened their homes. They picked up the pieces and started with a clean slate, rebuilding many of these homes to even better build quality and even installing storm shelters for, God forbid, another tornado. That sense of community thrived around things like school athletics, which resumed in the following school year, and these local businesses as well really influenced the attitude of Parkersburg residents. The 2010 U.S. Census found there was only a 1% decrease in the change of population compared to the 2000 census, that being less than 2 years removed from the tornado. Even better yet, the 2020 census found that there was a 7.8% increase from 2010, meaning that the town grew in the wake of such a violent tornado. This is remarkable because there's been a common theme with these smaller towns of shrinking populations as more people move to a more urban environment where there's more opportunity. With mechanized farming, there's less work opportunities in these smaller communities. However, Parkersburg has defied that convention and has allowed for an increase of population, which is not often seen in rural communities, as we said, never mind one that was impacted by one of the most violent tornadoes in United States history. It is also worth noting that even New Hartford saw population growth after the tornado, with a 10.5% increase in the 2020 census as compared to 2010. This ultimately leaves us with the conclusion that Parkersburg is a model for both disaster response and recovery. Fortunately, the advanced lead time of the warning of the tornado allowed for residents to seek shelter, and the plan in place by emergency management meant that they were able to mobilize quickly minutes after the tornado and ultimately maximize the amount of lives saved and instill this sense in the community of it being a great place to be. Of course, there was outside help that assisted in the recovery of Parkersburg, but you don't have a thriving community after an event like this if it isn't for the strongly rooted sense of community that there is. If you don't have this town identity that really rallies around each other, how is it possible to have such a thriving community after an event like this? There are many other communities around the country that have been impacted by similar types of disasters that didn't quite see the recovery that Parkersburg did. There are safety tips as well to be kind of gathered from this event. As we have seen, not even basements were safe in this EF5 level tornado. Storm shelters are kind of the only guaranteed survival one might have. Though it is expensive to have a personal shelter installed, whether it be in your home or somewhere adjacent, it should be the onus on communities in tornado-prone regions to have some sort of community shelter available that is able to save a good portion of residents that might not have basements or access to some sort of shelter. Obviously, these are freak events of tornadoes of this magnitude, but it's important to have, basement-style shelters readily available for when a moment like this happens. You are able to have the best chance of survival in the end. This concludes our in-depth look of the Parkersburg, Iowa EF5 tornado. If you like this show, please leave a rating in your podcasting app, and you want to see more like it, please leave suggestions and go check our YouTube channel out at June 1st. I'm Ethan Moriarty, and as always, stay safe out there when it comes to severe weather.